Okay, I know the conversations are rich. I know you all are learning from one another, but I would ask for you to now draw your attention to the stage. And as we draw the curtains on what has been an inspiring and intellectually enriching conference with many different facets of dialogue, debate, and conversations, it is my distinct honor to introduce our closing keynote speaker. The journey we've undertaken over the past days has been marked by not only insightful discussions, groundbreaking ideas, and passionate exchanges, but an opportunity for us to reflect on what can be, given where we have come from. And now to encapsulate this essence of our collective learning and collective memories, and to provide us with a vision for the future, but an opportunity, as I just learned, to reflect on the past. We are privileged to have with us a speaker whose wisdom and expertise are unparalleled. Dr. Verónica Vélez is a professor and associate dean of academic affairs in Woodring College at Washington University. Her research broadly analyzes racial inequities in education and the causes of those inequities and how they impact the educational trajectories and experiences of students of color, their families, and their communities. So please help me welcome to the stage, Dr. Vélez.
All right, I feel like I'm at that age now where my tech skills are starting to wane a little bit. So I'm gonna just give me a quick second while I get this going. Where's let me see. There it is. Yeah, all right. All right, buenos dias. Whoa. Is this working? No. Let's see. Hello, hello. We got more.
See.
That's it. Perfect. All right, buenos dias. How are you all doing today? All right, day 3. I always have the hard task. If I come at the end, I'm like, I gotta make it real good, because you all had probably some really good presentations the last 3 days. Anyway, I'm just so honored to be here with you all this morning, and so honored to have met some of these beautiful organizers that are part of the space. So before we get into it, can we give them a round of applause? So I'm thinking about the entire committee. And I also want to give I come from a mother who used to clean homes. And so I want to give all our staff and people who made our food possible. Who made sure this building was set up. And of course, I want to honor this incredible place, which is New Orleans, right? And I want to honor that, of course, we stand on indigenous land. And I want to recognize all federally and those that are not federally recognized indigenous communities, because the federal government cannot regulate indigeneity at home. So let's give another round of applause for him. So thank you all. So I feel so honored to be invited to come to this space. And I have to admit, I always have a little bit of nerves because what I'm going to share with you today, usually I get uninvited. And so I think about what it means to be bold. My training, my doctorate's in critical race theory, and I say that unapologetically. So I think about these concepts often, and apparently I'm banned in 26 states now. But I think about the importance, and I want to honor the young people that are on the screen right now, because I always think about, at the end of the day, I feel honored to come here, but really what I'm going to share today is a lot of story about their work. And a lot of story about the work of migrant mothers who I had the privilege to organize with for 16 years. Mothers very similar to my own as a migrant from Mexico, from Ciudad Guzman, Jalisco, if anybody's here from Mexico. And so I think about, see one hand. I got all excited when I see like the one hand. And so honoring them, and again, I know these pictures up here are from their graduation, and we often think about the outcome and rarely talk about the journey. And so I want to kind of share, because most of these folks on the screen, in fact, all of them are either teachers, grassroots organizers, social workers, and benefited from the very classes that I know many of you have been talking about, right? How to do community engaged work. And so, but what I'm going to kind of center today is a lot of what we've been doing together and having these conversations, particularly around this thing called diversity, equity, and inclusion, which for many of them, they would argue in front of you that those terms have become bankrupt in higher education. And how do we talk about those things when so many of us, like myself, wouldn't be up here had it not been for those that have paved the way to create diverse, equitable, and inclusive classrooms, right? So I want to honor that it's a complex conversation to have. But these young people are raising that maybe we need to ask a different set of questions. And so I want to raise those questions with you today and offer some ideas for how we move this work forward when it comes to service learning and community engagement. So I'm going to kind of, my hope is that I can answer 3 questions, sort of thinking about the centering of abolition as praxis. Now, some of you maybe have heard this term, may not be new to you, came onto the scene in the context of Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black lives. But this has actually a longer history, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm also going to talk about why abolition as a framework is so necessary, particularly to the work of educators and to the work of higher ed and the folks in this room. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll share some work from a beautiful colleague named Kendris Watson and some of the work he's doing on the impact, the physiological impact that schooling can have, particularly on Black men, and how we need to think about abolition in that context. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about why should abolition matter to you, right? Particularly in the context of service learning. I'm going to share 3 different stories, like I mentioned, and so I'm not going to give you more data and more facts. I think you had 3 days of that, but I want to sort of give some context around story and to share a little bit of my work with you all. So let's talk a little bit about abolition. So some of this work for me, in addition to thinking about the context of my social studies and history classes around slavery and talking about the first abolitionists, but coming back to abolition through Angela Davis's work was incredibly powerful. Because what Angela Davis tells us is that this notion of the prison and abolishing prisons shouldn't be seen through just the lens of an institution, but in terms of a mindset. How we think about carcerality and all the things that we do. So it does nothing to think about, she would argue that when we think about movements in the streets, what does that do when we haven't abolished the things in our homes or in our relationships that maintain carcerality in multiple spaces? And so she comes to say, what does it mean to begin to think about decarceration as a way of thinking about how we do things in society? Because if we think about it, one of her most famous lines, she says, prisons don't disappear social issues, they disappear human beings. And so in thinking about that, the work of us in education, we've been thinking, so what does this mean to think about schools in the same context as prisons? Now, some of you have been hearing the term like school to prison nexus or school to prison pipeline. And we've been really moving into a conversation that it's less about how prisons, we think about schools as a pipeline to prisons, but more how schools are becoming prisons themselves. And asking questions like my colleague David Stovall, who I lovingly refer to as Stove, he argues that similar to prison abolitionists, it should be understood in the practical sense that we are not talking about the destruction of buildings. Some of my students are like, so Vero, we're going to torch the building. I'm like, no, not now anyway. But instead, what we're trying to argue here is that we need a systemic accounting of schooling in historically disinvested and isolated communities. And this is important to think about, that it's not just a building or an institution, it's an ideological formation. That school in its most familiar form is not connected to any project of liberation. Now that may be hard for folks to think about. Shit, it's hard for me to think about. I wouldn't be up here. I mean, I think about all the reasons my parents migrated to this country so that I could have an education, right? So here I am, I'm probably one of the biggest critics of schooling and one of the biggest beneficiaries. I'm a walking contradiction. So how do we name the complexity when we say that school has never been designed to liberate? So schooling in this sense is a process intended to perpetuate and maintain the society's existing power relations and the institutional structures that support it, right? So as I think about this, I want to share a clip for you all. It's about 10 minutes, but I think it's worth watching because my friend and colleague, Dr. Kenjis Watson, is actually currently presenting at the Critical Race Theory and Education Conference in Chicago, is doing this incredible work. And I think he speaks more powerfully than anybody I know as to why abolition in the context of schooling is necessary. So we're going to watch a clip and then I'll come back and engage you all after that. I'm going to fast forward a tiny bit. Where is our folks? Is it not working? Uh-oh. We may have some technical issues. Let's see if we can make this work. It was working. It was working. I promise you. Wow. Well, we're gonna have to make do.
Oh, if you're doing it from in here.
It's not going. No, we're gonna do it a different way. Let's see if we can do it. Give us a second. Let me make sure I can do it this way.
Yeah, there
Sorry about that.
Yeah, when I got in, I didn't really believe it, and I was still set on going to a state school in the area. So I remember I was working at Jamba Juice at the time. Went next door to Starbucks to get the Wi-Fi, checked, found out I got into UC Davis and UCLA, immediately texted my mom. My mom called me, almost crying, super ecstatic. Honestly, I didn't believe it for like a week, and I kept thinking like they're gonna rescind that.
We didn't always have an abundant amount of food in my house growing up. We sometimes weren't certain that we were going to be able to sustain the home that we were living in. There was a belief that with academic achievement, graduation, that through those efforts we would be able to carve out a space of futurity, of sustainability for me and for my family.
The common narrative is if you do well in a schooling system, you get good grades, you get these opportunities to actually engage with other people who may be in industries or things that you're interested in, and then potentially a job in the future. What we haven't discussed, however, is the cost that has in terms of going through all those systems and order and compliance.
Yeah, so I was a biology major, just setting a standard for other young people that look up to me, right? I think some of the hardships I faced were probably some feelings of like isolation.
And although that story is unique to me and to my family, it's actually a common story amongst us, right, as Black folks. And it's an odd bargain to me because schooling in the US has never been intended to generate or create the possibility of Black wellness.
So now if we think about school as this thing to suffer through, then what does it mean for your physiological and your mental health, right? What does it mean in a place that you are going to where the requirement is for you to sit in your suffering?
So it's 200 people per class. I don't think I had one friend in any of my classes, right? Most of my friends were in like social studies and things like that. I never really considered them microaggressions until looking back at them, things like people not wanting to partner with me.
So as my mentor, Dr. Daniel Solorzano, often likes to say, for Chester Pierce, the micro and microaggression never was intended to mean small. The micro and microaggression was supposed to indicate the daily, the incessant, the insidious nature of these events, as opposed to something like a macro occurrence. And there's nothing small about daily encounters of harassment with campus police for Black students. There's nothing insignificant about daily encounters with professors who don't believe that the work you do is actually your work.
So everyone's born with a genetic code that they've inherited from their parents called DNA. This genetic code is incredibly long and it contains pockets of information called genes that are responsible for the characteristics we have. Our genetic code is actually condensed in chromosomes, and those chromosomes have little caps on the ends of them called telomeres. These telomeres help us maintain the stability of that code, but again, our research suggests that our stability is in danger based upon our experiences and our environment. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and other forms of trauma can contribute to premature biological aging.
As I researched telomere length and started thinking about applying that focus to a study of Black men in white space, I invited some young guys that I had been working with, along with other Black students at UCLA, to participate in this study, where we had almost 50 Black men. And the findings were unsurprising and yet disappointing. What we found is 30% of them had telomere lengths that were similar to a group of women 2 times their age who had survived breast cancer.
If your body is consistently in a stress response, all the functions that normally help us maintain our internal stability begin to dysfunction. The same goes for the maintenance that's around their telomeres. Our telomeres will begin to shorten as a result of this dysfunction.
So unsurprising because we know that Black people die early, but disappointing because of that story that we're told that success in schooling, success in academic achievement could somehow mitigate the harm of racial stress.
Looking back, right, and realizing like how, compact my time was and how I was always on the go and stressing, and it was never no like time for myself. I said I wasn't surprised. I think you mentioned something like you have shortened telomeres, like one of the shortest in the study.
I think my need for a better understanding, more holistic measurements of wellness really came from being gifted a succulent. And really lots of succulents. And I would kill them, plant after plant, succulent after succulent. And I think I killed them because I was following this narrow-minded understanding of how to care for them. This belief that they could survive without water, that they could survive in harsh environments. And really what I learned is that they're really sensitive and need critical and ongoing care. That these plants, they look fine on the outside. I was really operating under this beautiful pink that I saw around a lot of the succulents. And with further study, further research, I learned that pink for some species was an innate sign of their health. And that could be a sign that they were dying. And it's called stressing the succulent. And so when I think about our young people, and I think about these measurements of their wellness, I'm reminded of these succulents, and that we have to go beyond the myths of what they can endure, the myths of what it means, the measurements of what it means when they're doing well, like grading and test scores and college matriculation, because just like those succulents, they can look fine. But because of the stressors that they're experiencing, because of the harsh environments that they're immersed within, they can be dying.
It was a biology course, like a lab biology course I had taken during my last quarter at UCLA. And we got to choose a topic. And I went with colon cancer. I saw how prevalent it was in African-American males. This was right after spring break, right? And while I'm doing my own research on the side with the class and everything, I started feeling really bad. And I was just like lightheaded and dizzy and always tired. Even the gastroenterologist, he was kind of like, yeah, this is weird, right? You've been seeing blood in your stool, you've been feeling these things. It's like, you're 22 years old, like it's not likely to be anything too serious. It might be something like a hemorrhoid or something like that. And he was like, you know, we could do like a colonoscopy. I was like, I'll do it. So signed up or scheduled it and did the procedure and was hoping it was nothing, but they had found like multiple polyps in my colon and they had taken them out. They had found one that was 4 centimeters in size, another that was 2.5 centimeters, another that was 1.5 centimeters, and had to take them out in pieces because there were so many and so large.
Chronological age is really how long we've been on the planet, right? How many trips we make around the sun. What telomeres tell us is, I think, a more accurate form of age. It tells us how old are our cells. Our life expectancy is directly tied to cellular aging, not necessarily how long we've been on the planet.
I graduated a month after that in June of 2018, and immediately I went to Eritrea, which is where my parents are from. And I was there for 6 weeks. I feel like it was the break I needed. I was home, I was reading, I'm with my grandma, right? My cousins and uncles and aunties that I haven't seen since I was young. It was cool. It was really a centering, like grounding experience, I feel like right after. And then I kind of carried that over going back to San Jose. Every morning, walk to the park and I'd read for an hour and a half. And I felt like this was meditative. Like I never legit meditated, right? Or like the things that you think of when you say meditation, but this was my way of like grounding myself. And I felt calm, cool, collected the rest of the day, no matter what I was getting into. It's kind of like a indigenization.
So Wayne Swinson and I, a colleague at the Health and Equity Research Lab at SF State, have been able to do a follow-up study that looks again at Philmon's telomere length. And what those study findings show is that even though it's been about 1.5 to 2 years, Philmon's telomeres, which had been extremely harmed by environmental and stressful hazards, have actually stopped eroding.
Because we're saying that the world in its current moment is not acceptable. There has to be something different. And reform is not enough, because I think a lot of times when people hear me say that, oh, we just need to build a better thing. No, the thing is the problem. When we think about fugitive spaces, maroonage, or abolition, it's pushing us to dig deeper into that ancestral wisdom in terms of saying, okay, if this thing is not working, what are you willing to do, right? What are you willing to build? Who are you willing to build it with?
I remember Cornel West saying how hard it is to be a critical thinker in this country. And he pushes us, he says, we must think critically, but it takes courage to think. And he says, you have to say that in America because it's such a profoundly anti-intellectual civilization. He says this country is market-driven. It's obsessed with business and short-term gain. And it places a premium on intelligence, which really is nothing but a manipulative faculty. This is not about profiting off of Black suffering. Rather, this is about organizing our communities, educating our communities, and pulling in the people who are willing to center the health and well-being of Black people so that we can collectively save our own lives.
That was in May of 2018 that they had removed the polyps. I got tested 6 months after, and he said I was clear. Told me to come a year later, which was actually in November of 2019. And again, I was clear. all good. So now we can wait like 3 months or 3 years before I go and get my next test. And I feel good about where I am now, for sure. Hoping in good health. Yeah, none of that, no polyps, good health, good standing.
Powerful video. One of the things I think I most appreciate about Kenja's work is it isn't just about naming that which dehumanizes us, naming that which should be eliminated, but he's also talking about the things that actually could grow our life expectancy. And so in watching that video, one of the things that stands out for me is the way that Philemon was able to go back home, back to his indigenous community, and that what he didn't share is that the research actually, when they retested his telomeres actually grew, which means his life expectancy expanded, right? When we think about those measures. And so I think about this question often, right? Can education happen in the institution commonly known as school? Because for me, schooling and education aren't necessarily synonymous. And if we think about what that video begins to share, it starts to help us to think about what happens when we think about education much more expansively, about reconnecting to the wisdom of our communities and our families, about reconnecting to lessons that have been lost because school has told us not to look at home as a place of educational richness. What happens when we can radically imagine a different kind of future? And so for me, abolition isn't just about tearing down, it's about how do we build the radical imaginary? How do we build the courage to think and to create the space to do that? Now, in my own work, I came into some of this more recently. A lot of my work has been about how can we think about different tools and methods to understand how racism operates, and particularly when it comes to school. So a lot of my work has been building geographic frameworks so that I can understand what is the geographic footprint of racism. How can tools like maps help us to think about, that relationship, that socio-spatial relationship of which race is necessarily a part of. And some of the work that I've done has been really to think about, this is Washington State, which is my home school, not home, but my home in the last 10 years. And beginning to map out things like, I worked on this project for the Latino Centers for Health at University of Washington, and we were asking our question, it's like, we need to map out some of these educational ecosystems. And why is it that for us in Washington State, Latinos have the lowest educational attainment? What's going on? Because we need more Latino physicians. Because in Washington, only 300 Latino physicians exist to serve the entire state. So when I think about this, I said, well, let's map out where are Latino youth located? And where is the concentration of four-year technical and community colleges? So when I look at this map, it becomes clear. Could you have built these further away? The distance between where that concentration exists and where they have to travel primarily to attend? What does it say about, for some young people in the state, they can have a university in their backyard or a college in their backyard, but for others, they have to leave home? What does that tell young people about their own self-worth, about their community self-worth? If the whole point is you have to leave them to become quote unquote educated. And then as I was doing this work, I was building out some of the work that I've been working from California, which is where I went to UCLA with Kenja, that's how we know each other. But I did a lot of work around this, what's called the educational pipeline analysis. And I was looking at, for every 100 students that start in the K-12 system, how many will go on to graduate? How many will go on to get a BA, a graduate degree, and so forth? And I began to look at these things intersectionally. How does income or immigration status or language play into that? How does that factor into those conversations? And how do we understand those outcomes? And when I was sharing this data with a group of Native teachers, because we had this also broken out by Indigenous communities in Washington State, one of the teachers said to me, Vero, this is all great and I appreciate the analysis, but let me ask you a question. What salmon wants to swim through a pipeline? And it stopped me, right? And I think what that teacher raised for me was that I wasn't asking the right question. Here I was so obsessed about fixing leaks thinking about outcomes, thinking about what creates, and when she was pointing to me, she's like, just like Stovall and Ken just have been pointing, we're not looking in the right place. We're fixated on a system that continues to be, the likely cause of what the data is showing us. So how do we think differently? So to engage that third question, why should abolition matter to you all? I want to tell 3 stories. And the first story comes from my work working with migrant mothers. And I'm going to tell it through the story of dichos. How many people here are familiar with dichos? Everyday sayings. Okay, good. Yay. I said like dichos. Everybody know what dichos? Some of them are really cruel. Like, I don't know if you grew up, some of them were like, or your parent would give you a dicho and they would just be like, off you go. And I'm like, I have no idea what that means. I don't know what the lesson is, but I must figure it out. We'll figure it out at some point. But dichos were those little like pedagogies of the home, right? A coded message that you kind of had to figure out the lesson in it, right? And so the first one I remember, and I'm sharing some of them that are like least evident, that these aren't necessarily ones that I was familiar with growing up, but they became very evident when I was organizing. And this one is arrieros somos y en el camino andamos. And I'll talk about what that means in a second. But let me engage, and I share these images with you with their permission. So for 16 years, I was a grassroots organizer working with migrant families. And a lot of this work was particularly connected to thinking about how migrant families can and should be at the helm of educational reform. They were disrupting this notion of parent engagement as just something you go to kind of get fixed because you were a parent who, quote unquote, didn't care about education or told about how you should care for your child. These mothers were like, hell no. Our role is in terms of leading these movements, having conversations about how we have wisdom that can bear in the kinds of decision-making that are, of the schools that our children attend. But I remember coming out of undergrad, and starting my graduate work, and I wanted to be involved in my home community because I felt like I had some organizing background. And I remember coming to Susana. She was the lead mom of this particular group, and I'll talk about them in a second. And I just wanted to help. And I just wanted to do some good. And so I came to Susana. I'm like, what can I do? How can I add value? And the question she asked me, she said, well, are you a baseball player? And I'm like, that is an odd ass question. I have no idea how to respond to that. And I didn't want to get it wrong, right? So I was like, shoot, if I get this answer wrong, she's not gonna let me help. She's not gonna let me be here, a part of the space. And so she could tell that I was really uncomfortable and I was trying to figure out how to respond. And she's like, the reason I ask is because there are a lot of you that come here that want to help. But let me ask you a question. Are you going to step and run? So let me ask you again, are you a baseball player? And that's when I was like, no, not a baseball player. Not going to step and run. She's like, okay, so tonight we have an adult literacy class. There's about 80 students. You're the teacher. Good luck. And I remember like freaking out. I don't even know how, she's like, well, I'm like, where do I start? She's like, you start with the verb to be. I'm like, what's the verb to be? I don't know what the verb to be is. But she was the one that got me thinking, again, shifting the logic of my role with this organization. So this space right here was known as La Casita. And it was a space that was donated by some organizations for a lot of the grassroots groups to do their organizing work. And we had Friday night. Friday night was our night. And so we would spend hours here, and they called the La Casita La Universidad del Pueblo, University of the Community. And we began doing this work. And so I watched how these mothers led campaigns, led workshops on popular education, thinking about inquiry, community-based inquiry. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to nominate you for an award. Because why should just people with 3 letters after their last name, who often confuses those individuals about who's expert, why not nominate you all? Because in so many ways, the organic intellectuals that you are merits to be recognized. And so I nominated them for, I don't know how many people here are connected to AERA, the American Education Research Association, and I nominated them for the Paulo Freire Award. And I said, let's see what happens, right? And about a month later after I nominated them, we found out we got the award. And so we were so excited and we were like, oh, we got it, but wait a second. The conference is in New Orleans. We're in Pasadena. So I was like, okay, how many tamales do we have to sell? Can we organize some bake sales? Figure out, and I thought maybe there's a couple of the moms who were able to fly. We're like, maybe we can possibly fundraise enough for a plane ticket, maybe 2. And then Connie was like, oh no, hell, we all want to go. She's like, I got a 15-passenger van. I think I can fit 25. Let's roll. And so I was like, all right, okay, cool. So we got her van tuned up and we drove. And we had to go north because we couldn't go on the 10 freeway because it was too dangerous because again of immigration status. So it took us an extra 10 hours. It was a 40-hour drive. And we didn't stop because we didn't have enough money to pay for a hotel on the way. So we just rotated drivers. We just kept going. And so we landed, this is part of some of the work that we were doing in popular education, some of the workshops we held. But we landed here, we landed in New Orleans, at the convention center. And I remember getting there, I look a little tired. I was like, can Beto at least put a little water on her face? They're like, nope, we gotta go. We gotta take advantage of the space. We don't get here very often. And so they all look great. I don't know how that happened. But we ended up walking into this panel, this presentation, and it was a panel of professors of history of education. And so we entered just as one of the professors was saying, so my conclusion is that if you are a Mexican-American parent and are uneducated, the likelihood is your child will be uneducated. And I just remember La Señora Oliva, who's right here in front. She's like, Vero, you're gonna translate for me. I got some questions. And it was packed. It was about as big as this room, right? And so I was like, okay. And so as soon as Q&A opens up, La Señora Oliva raises her hand and she looks at me and she tells the group, so if I understand you correctly, these parents back here are the demographic that you speak of. But none of our children are uneducated. So how do we fit your theory? The professor couldn't say, damn. But afterwards, they're like, we need to go take a picture because they're probably famous or something. So let's take a picture, right? So, and she kept doing that. Like at every single panel that she went to, there was one panel we went to on Latina mothers and involvement in schools. And I remember she looked at me and she's like, I could have told you that. There's nothing unusual about what they're saying. But sure enough, during Q&A, she raised her hand and she said, so you've done all this work on Latino families. How many of you actually have gone back to those communities and shared that work with them? And I remember a lot of them were like, well, no, it's part of our work dissertation. She's like, so let me ask you a question. What is the point of your work if you haven't gone back into those spaces to share that work and continue to build? So on the way back, after having that experience, they're like, Beto, why can't we be researchers too? And so we began, so this is when they got the award. Of course, we all had to look the same. I feel like this is very much I think about my mom, she dressed me the same like all my cousins. So this is very typical in our communities to dress the same. But on the way back, this is our drive back to Pasadena, and they're like, we're gonna start our own organization, El Centro de Educación del Pueblo, and we're gonna become researchers. And so for them, it was vital that we get to author our own lives. We get to determine what inquiry matters in our experiences. And so we drove, and this is my tocaya, which means she shares the same name as I do, Verónica. And she was my co-pilot, and the whole time she's like, Vero, we're gonna make this happen, right? So 40 hours was our planning drive back. And then we get to a certain checkpoint on the drive into California. And I could tell that they all froze. There was a moment of like, we're getting to a checkpoint. We gotta just get through that checkpoint. And so sure enough, I remember seeing rosaries come out, right? Everybody got real stiff in the car. And then as soon as we cross, Verónica tells me, she says, Vero, arrieros somos y en el camino andamos. And I said, tell me more about what that means to you. And she says, well, if I understand it correctly, the arrieros were a scorned group, similar to migrants today. But somehow along the journey, when we cross, we're gonna need of each other. My liberation is tied to your liberation. And if I understand it's a fundamental principle, what does it mean for me to understand that we're always gonna be on this journey together, always together. So, Vero, arrieros somos y en el camino andamos. We keep moving, we keep working, we keep organizing. And so I remember holding on to that, right? And that was one of the line of the organization is called as Centro de Educación del Pueblo, arrieros somos y en el camino andamos, right? As we continue to develop. And so after this, coming back, you know, we had different kinds of conversations, and I kept asking them, you know, what does this organization mean to you? And so another one of the mothers said, pero fácil, no más atole con el dedo. And other mothers are like, that's it. And I'm like, oh, no, you're gonna have to explain that to me. And she says, well, this dicho for me kind of speaks to when you're a mother, you're a chest feeding parent, and you get tired, you make atole. And atole is a flour-based drink, and you put your finger in the atole and you rub it on the baby's lips as a way to pacify the baby, as a way to trick the baby. She's like, this school district has been feeding us atole for many years. So this organization is no more atole with the finger. We will no longer be fooled into deceit for real reform. Man, I nearly fell off my chair when she said that. I'm like, I've been in grad school for 4 years, and you in 5 words just theorized power and resistance in ways that no other text was able to do, right? And you theorized from the flesh of what it meant for her to understand that resistance, that trickery, that deceit. And so I was really drawn to this dicho. And for me, this dicho probably represents most powerfully the work that we're doing at Western. And so you won't be able to read this, but just to kind of give some context, this is students have been mobilizing since I started on campus in 2013 to create a liberatory education, to challenge schooling and create a space where their lives can become fully possible. And so the Student Assembly for Power and Liberation was formed in 2016 by many of the students that I had the privilege to work with as part of a program I directed in education and social justice. Now, their demands were not heard, but in 2018, students took over the president's office. So let me say it even louder. You're not meeting our needs. Our education no longer serves us. We want an education that's fully humanized. And what they understood, I think, really powerfully, similar to the mothers, that all this diversity and equity and inclusion talk was just talk. And they began to think really deeply, and we began studying. A lot of the times I met with them in basements of buildings. We met at coffee shops, we met in people's homes. We began meeting in areas where the university could not surveil us. And if you want more, I can do it during Q&A. I took out all the slides I had on the books we read, but if you're curious, I'm happy to share those with you all. But this one in particular, this is work done by Sandy Grande, who writes Red Pedagogy. If anybody knows Sandy Grande's work, you should all read it. But she cites Robin Kelly in her piece called Refusing the University, and I think it speaks volumes and gets at the heart of what the students were organizing for. And she says, the fully racialized architecture upon which the modern university is built cannot be radically transformed by simply adding darker faces, safer spaces, better training, and a curriculum that acknowledges historical and contemporary oppression. This is a bit like asking for more Black police officers as a strategy to curb state violence. So they were calling out the contradictions that we didn't ask the right questions the first time. One of the things that I asked them to think about is, let's go back into the history. Are you all the first students to begin to ask these questions, to call for a deeper conversation, to trouble the logics of oppression? And we went to the archives. We have a local historian who's been collecting archives about the university since 1960. And what we found was that the same shit still existed back then. We can go back and look at the way that these things unfolded. This question of integration, this question of justice the questions that they were asking were very similar to the questions that students were asking today. And asking, when we think about liberals, when we think about, some of you, I heard we're having conversations around the neoliberal university, right? And how that plays out. They were asking those questions in 1968. So when they pushed the university to ask, we need to do better, they wrote a letter to the president and they said this: in 1968, Black students at WW were openly fighting and resisting the same structures of power we are today. We continue the important work that they started. We honor their words, their spirits, and their strength by leaving you again with this quote: when Western begins to make phony excuses and resist needed changes, we will be forced to look at Western as an enemy to Black and non-white people and act accordingly. In short, there will be political consequences for political mistakes. And they end with this. They say this movement is not just limited to Western, but it's connected to others where students are demanding that they have power over their own lives, bodies, and histories. As Cristo so beautifully reminds us, this movement is decades old, and we walk in the history of those who came before us. We recognize all forms of oppression have been resisted since their inception. As Hopi elders, June Jordan, Grace Lee Boggs, and Alice Walker continue to remind us, we are the ones we have been waiting for. And so I share this because, again, I think about what does abolition mean in this context? It means a willingness to have courage, to ask questions that maybe have not been asked. And for many of us who have benefited from these systems, how do we actually have a conversation that opens up this privilege that we have? Not as one where we want to just include people on this journey, but to kind of think about how do we reimagine this journey? How do we reimagine this thing called school? And as of fall of next year, as a result of their efforts, we will now bring back ethnic studies to Western. We used to be the second college in the US. Yeah, it's amazing what they're doing. Thanks to these students. Because in 1972, the College of Ethnic Studies was shut down. We were the second College of Ethnic Studies in the entire country after San Francisco State. And it shut down. And according to the administration at the time, because it imploded on the inside, but these students are bringing it back. It was their efforts and their organizing, and we launch again in fall of 2024. So I want to just honor their work and their efforts here, which I think are really important to note. Now, the last story I want to share with you is a little bit more personal. And this is a dicho that I did grow up with. I heard a lot. And this one has pretty much a similar, I guess, an English counterpart to it. Lo que bien se aprende nunca se olvida. It's kind of like a lesson well learned is never forgotten. That's the closest thing I can think of, right? Now, this is a lesson that my mother taught me. So I won't tell you the year, date myself, but late 70s, more or less. So my mother, Águeda Nelida Díaz Gutierrez, an immigrant from Central Mexico, I mentioned Ciudad Guzmán, Jalisco. And I remember growing up in our home, and she would always tell me, I don't care how many degrees you have, you can still be mal educada. You could still be poorly educated. Educación for us means something very different. Now it means knowing how to greet somebody, knowing how to say goodbye. It means valuing togetherness, something my mother always reminds me when I'm home and I'm on my computer a little bit too long. She'll always be like, close it up, you need to be present. Or when during COVID, when I went home and stayed to take care of my dad who was in hospice, and my mom had the TV blasting, everything going on, like trying to teach a class. She's like, oh, you're gonna have to deal with the noise. Because in this home, we're centered, not your world, not your work, our families. So she always reminded me. So I'd always tell my students, it's just life here. We got a Univision in the background, kid crying over there, it's just how it is. But I always think about this in the context of being bien educada means that for many of us that grew up in migrant homes, particularly Latino migrant homes, it takes us about an hour to say goodbye. And in that hour, we're usually inching closer to the door than we are to the car. Or when we leave the comalan to heat that tortilla, even though we don't know who needs it, that's being bien educada. So I was very social at a young age, something that my first grade teacher didn't really acknowledge or didn't care for. So I remember being called into my first grade classroom, and as many of us that were children of migrants, we were translators. And I got really good at translating to my favorite. So I remember this moment where my teacher tells, my mom, I get called in and my mom's like, okay, you're gonna translate for me. So that she's like, your daughter needs to pay attention. She talks too much. She's a little too social. She's not doing work independently. So I look at my mother and I told her in Spanish, teacher says I'm the best student in the class. Pretty perfect, getting good grades, doing what I need to do. And I could tell my mom was nodding, and the conversation ensued. But for those of us who were translators, we not only translated verbally, we also translate emotionally. And I remember seeing the look on my mother's face, the shame that this teacher was making her feel for not knowing how to speak English. And it was subtle, right? But you could just feel it as a child, someone who adores her mother, to be able to say, like, I feel her shame. That moment of insecurity where she struggled and couldn't quite make sense of things. And of course, I was feeling a little bit guilty for lying to her, but that was the story, and that was probably the first memory I ever have of rage. And I think about how that memory was in part the reason I went into organizing with mothers like my own. So for many of us that come up here and say we do critical race or we do theories, for some of us it is about the academizing, but for us, some others of us, it's about the personal connection to home, and personal connection to rage, and personal experiences of seeing the harm that was being done to our families. So anyway, fast forward, and I think about many, many years later. I think my mom, it's funny, I called her because I said to her, you know, Mom, COVID hit. I don't know how to grow anything. My mom, even though we lived in LA, my mom always had something growing in the backyard. So here's an example of this is her more or less today. This is our mandarin tree. My mom grew up on the proverbial rancho, right, in Mexico. And so we have a little nopal, because I had to get this from my mom because she kept stealing the neighbors. And she would tell me, Mija, they don't know it's food. I'm like, I know, but you can't go around stealing the neighbors' nopales. So we finally put a nopal in for her recently. I'm like, we're gonna grow your own nopales here. But we had a guava tree. We had all these different things. But when I was growing up, I was too busy with school to pay attention to what my mom was doing in the backyard. And so here I was, 40-some years old, and I call my mom, I go, Mommy, I need to figure out how to grow a tomato because there's none in the store and everything's falling apart. I need to grow something. So she took about 20 minutes to scold me and tell me, I've been trying to teach you this since you were 5. You didn't listen. But after about 20 minutes of that, she said, this is what you got to do. So you got to put this in the soil. You can't plant with this plant because they kind of hate each other. You got to think about which plants need sun, how you got to turn certain plants toward the sun, keep certain plants in the shade. She started teaching me all these techniques. And so I remember this was my little humble garden, right? When I call my mom, I go, Mom, I need to figure out how to make this grow. But thanks to her lessons, within a few weeks, this was my garden. I had so many tomatoes, tomatillos. I mean, I can go on, I made like a salsa garden. But I remember like going around the neighborhood, I'm like, tomatoes? You want some tomatoes? I didn't know what to do with so many tomatoes. And I remember calling my mom after the abundance in my first try, right? I go, Mommy, how did I not know that you were this genius? This mathematical, scientific genius that could make my garden go from nothing to this level of abundance. And she looked at me, she's like, but why would you see me that way? School never taught you to see me as a genius. And to this day, it still hurts. Because it didn't matter that I had a degree in critical race. It didn't matter that I was committed to movement building. I couldn't see it in my own mother. So when I think about abolition, I think about that so much of our work is about, sometimes for so many of us, it's about how do we find our way back home. It is about movements, it is about organizing, but it is for many of us reconnecting to what's been lost by the very thing that we've been told was supposed to be good for us, was supposed to make us more socially mobile. And yet something was lost, right? I remember sharing the story with my students, and so my student asked me, she said, so Vero, who are you uninterrupted? And I couldn't answer that question. Because for so many of us, we have become interrupted. And it takes courage to ask that of the very thing that has been, like I mentioned, we've been told has been so good for us. So as I kind of close, I want to kind of leave you with this notion of abolitionist praxis. And what does that mean for us in this work doing service learning and community engagement? And I want us to think about 3 things. And I'm drawing here specifically, again, from the work of Sandy Grande. It's an article, you can probably Google Scholar it, you'll find it. It's called Refusing the University. And one of the things she says is that when we think about abolition or decolonization or fugitivity concepts, I won't get into too much today, I'm happy to answer more in the Q&A. But this notion of abolition, we are called to co-resist. And here's the beauty about the work that you all do. Because in some way, this work that you have in terms of building these partnerships beyond the university, to think about the ways in which we build service learning, if we want to call it that, or community engagement, we have the possibility of doing something incredibly radical. And I would argue, some may push me on this kind of work cannot be branded the same way as DEI. Because it requires that we build in ways that extend beyond those university walls, that machinery is always good at branding. the next thing, reordering those strategies into the next thing. And so she calls us to do three things. The first one is this notion of collectivity. And here I want to be very clear. She's talking specifically about how do we know that the journey is not just about the self. The journey is about how we build together. Abolition at its core is about imagination. It's not just about dismantling, it's about creating. The only way we can do that, the only way we can build a radical imaginary is through collective strategies. Now she's arguing here that when we think of collectivity, make no mistake, we're not talking about models that continue to see the lens through see our communities through the lens of empathy. We have a lot of those. She's calling us to think about how do we move from empathy to solidarity. And in that shift, how are we setting a different praxis? That's abolition. She talks about reciprocity. And here reciprocity, I think about the ethic of how do we hold ourselves accountable, but refuse to dispose of each other. Reciprocity is that part that says we have to care, we have to embed a deep ethic of care in those relationships. I know I've been a part of justice spaces, and because of my age, I'm having to learn a lot from young people. And sometimes I get it wrong. I'm far from perfect. But I think about being in spaces that have abolition at its core, we don't dispose of each other. Because we recognize that to become liberated, we need to liberate each other in the work. And that part for me has been really important. And understanding that reciprocity that she speaks to is core to that, about how do we, what she argues, hold ourselves accountable to the collective, requires a commitment to engage, extend, trouble, speak back to, and intensify our words and deeds. And the last thing she speaks to is this notion of mutuality. And here I want to quote her because I think it's important that I get her words right. And she says, one of the many ways the academy recapitulates colonial logics is through the overvaluing of fast, new, young, and individualistic voices, and the undervaluing of slow, elder, and collective ones. For Indigenous peoples, such begin and end with land, centering questions of what it means to be a good relative. One of the core aspects of abolition for me is always this connection to place. We cannot do this work without a deeper connection to land, water, and place. And so what she argues in this notion of mutuality, she says, we got to think beyond those things that disconnect us from the place where is here, and really understanding that relationship. And that for me has been the hardest one, because I feel like when I have a lot of my good friends at Western are Native feminists, and they're like, Vero, what's your connection to land? I'm like, I don't know. I go, I have a relationship to displacement, but I don't know what my relationship to land is. And so they're pushing me on this, right? And if I'm going to engage abolition, that's the call. What is your relationship to place? What is your relationship to land? And so in all of this, I think deeply about, what does it mean for you all? As thinking about these three things, I go back to the radicality that this work can be. And maybe it's less about service learning and maybe it's more about movement building. And if we shift to that lens, if we shift away from service learning to movement building, what does that open up for us? What then becomes the call in our work, our call in the relationships we have with folks inside and outside of the academy? And I think this is what Sandy Grandy is calling us to do. And one of the things that I find so incredibly hopeful is I think about, the mothers, the young people, my own mother, and I think about her work, and this is what gives me hope. Right? Being here today with you gives me hope. So I wanted to end with just the words of Susana, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to honor her words in Spanish, but I'm going to leave the quote in English up here for you all. And so she says, La esperanza surge de luchas que resultan de nuestra memoria y experiencia, y al mismo tiempo unen la responsabilidad individual con nuestras metas del cambio. Pero la esperanza no se materializa del aire. Tiene que ser alimentada, desarrollada, debatada, examinada y actuada para que se convierta en algo real. Esto solo se va a lograr en comunidad y toma tiempo, pero siempre vale la pena. Thank you all. Thank you for this time with you this morning. Really appreciate you all. Thank you. Thank you.
While we're transitioning, please put your questions in the Menti. We will have 10 minutes this morning to follow up with questions with Dr.
You can just call me back.
Yeah, we'll call you that. And we'll have a conversation this morning, like as we did. All right, while we're waiting, I hope you all are loading your or inputting your question. All right, question, please.
So thank you so much, Bill. I appreciate it. We heard you at continuance of service, why you're here.
So first, thank you for the presentation. I heard you earlier this year at continuums of service, and it brought tears to my eyes. And your last quote reminded me of how we kind of started off this conference with the pre-conference and the community grounding with Ms. Carol Babel, who talks about radical hope as this kind of grounding for her to continue doing this work over the years. You know, our universities, our institutions, our organizations, our disciplines are oftentimes our spaces of toxicity, of undermining, of individualism. And so for you, how do you marry the piece that you sort of receive from these community settings into creating the kinds of spaces you see in the community, in the university? So I'm really interested in like, how do we not just accept that there are spaces like that and kind of grind through them, but how do we transform them so they look more like the community settings we try to expose our students to and less like the places that break us down?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I was really lucky that I came from training. Kendrick is a good example of it as well. We had training with this incredible scholar, Dr. Danny Solórzano at UCLA. And, he does work particularly around LACRIT, racial microaggressions. He had this class called the RAC. We called it the RAC, but it stands for Research Apprenticeship Course. And when we were his students, we were required to enroll in that class every quarter, you know? And if we graduated and if we were in town and didn't come to RAC, oh, we would hear it from Danny. So one of the things he expected us in being one of the students is that we would always foster an intergenerational space. And what he did, unlike other faculty did, he opened this class to high school youth. He opened his class to mothers. He opened his class to community organizers. So I come out of spaces within the university that felt very not like the university. There wasn't necessarily a grade. It was like we were expected to participate, but there wasn't like this metric or standardized approach to it. It was collectively driven. We own that space. But to be in conversation with folks beyond the university walls to shape the kinds of questions we ask within them, I think has always given me a sensibility of the possibility, right, of what we could do inside universities to create really emancipatory spaces. But the reason that happened was because Danny willed it. Danny made the effort to say, I'm gonna do this. This is gonna be like because all the RACs were intended to teach us research methods. That was as doctoral students, that was the plan. And he's like, no, it's not. I'm gonna teach you a different kind of method. And so I come out of that, and a lot of us have created mini RACs where we've gone. So for me, that model made it possible to do the work that we did with students, right? So the RAC, I think, offered me a possibility, and I think I was able, like, I had the privilege of proposing this to my department. Luckily, I had a supportive chair, which also matters a lot, and important department heads who allowed us to create a similar 1 to 2 credit ongoing class for students to come in, to be a part of it. And I can talk about some of the complexities of getting it to count for their major, but they could always get a minor with those credits, and that was the program that I directed. And so I think for me, that was a big part of it, is of seeing, coming from traditions that had that model and then applying them to higher ed. So I want to be clear that even though as I talk about all the ways that schooling has dehumanized us, I know that I remember with Danny, I think I dropped out like 3 times from grad school. I was like, I don't need this PhD. Who told Beto she needed a PhD? Nobody. I was so embarrassed to run into Danny in the halls, right? Because I'm like, oh, I gotta like run into him. And he was such a loving educator. Remember, I hadn't seen him in 2 years, and I ran into him in the hallway, and he's like, it's gonna be okay. I love you. Let's just meet. And I was always like, okay, I'm not gonna be judged. I'm not gonna be told I'm a bad student, right? And I remember the 3rd time I dropped out, and he said to me, Beto, I hear you on all the things you're saying. But he said to me, like, had it not been for this place, you and I would have never met. And I'm glad we met. And so we have to account for the possibilities that those things can afford us too. And Danny was a big part of my journey.
Okay, thank you for starting us off. We have a couple questions. We don't have a lot of time, but I do want to ask 2 questions. The first is about Latin America, okay? So you started us off saying you didn't use the word contentious, but I think you can be contentious in certain spaces. In Latin America, education, schools, and universities were conquests of socio-political struggles against church and conservatives. Why would we want to abolish, quote, or refuse, quote unquote, our small victories?
Yeah, that's super powerful. So thank you for whoever sent that question out. You know, and again, I think part of the conversation around abolition, and I think I want to go back to some of the initial sort of framing that Angela Davis and others have offered us. I think what the questions that Angela poses, and I think they need to be asked in different ways in different contexts, is asking a deeper logic of what in this particular place, be it school, be it the state, right, be other kinds of institutions, what about this institution is locked into an architecture of dehumanization? That doesn't mean all of the institution is bad. What they're arguing for is that unless we're willing to sort of talk about those deeper logics and to understand that history, so I think a lot of us that do abolitionist work, we're called to be historians, to understand how this has evolved, is to say that even in those spaces, like how can the potential of some of the things that have happened that were radical, maybe came out of struggle, how do we continue to amplify that? And if you're at a public institution, which is the institution, I'm at a public institution, it's important for me to be at a public institution. But we have to remember, even universities, and I don't know how it is in the particular context that you're speaking from, are still largely governed by the state. And if that's the context, how do we understand the state's continued role to shape the future of the university? And I think abolition simply said, let's ask that question. Let's not accept the things that we were given because somebody told us it was moral, right, and good. But every generation needs to wrestle with the questions of like, how do we understand those contradictions? Are there contradictions? And how is this? Because I'm telling you right now, like I think about when I came into some of this work, I was shaped by a particular historical moment. And that historical moment was really about access and diversity. I mean, my mentor really believed as long as he got, I remember walking into his class and there was like 30 Chicanas looking at me. And I'm like, yo, I am not the only one here, right? And remembering that felt so radical to be in a space like that. And for him, that was his theory of change. His theory of change is as long as I get him in the door, we're gonna be okay. The generation that's come after said it's not enough. That dream was partial. It got us here, but it's not enough. So the question for me will always be in a certain context, how are local communities defining the current terrain of the political struggle? And how do those questions raise for us an opportunity to open up a dialogue at our institutions to say, okay, what has been working well, but are there logics that we have accepted because someone told us it was moral, right, and good, and we're failing to question how they may be harming some? And again, that's the piece of abolition. It's really like people want to think about an institution, which I know that's where our heart wants to go and our head wants to go, but it's really about an ideology, a logic that maintains carcerality, punishment, surveillance. So that would be my question. And again, the other part of abolition is always about the radical imaginary. It's not just about tearing down, it's about how do we continue to build what's good? How do we continue to mobilize the things that are working to further amplify liberatory aims? And so that's what I would respond to that.
All right, we're gonna take you back to your mother. And this question is similar to your mama's genius. How can we invite the brilliance of our partners into the service learning lessons? Sorry about that. Service learning classrooms and compensate them with the institutional infrastructure. That's horrible. Okay, let me start off again. Similar to your mother's genius, how can we invite the brilliance of our partners into the service learning classroom and compensate them when the institutional infrastructure is not there yet?
So I think part of it goes back to those 3 points that Sandy Grande was raising, right? Collectivity, reciprocity, and mutuality. And I'm gonna take back to a little bit of the story. In LA, this was, I believe it was 2015, I can't remember the year, maybe it was 2016. Anyway, but we had a march in LA, and the organizations were unable to secure county permits. So when we did the march, and this was a May Day March, we ended up taking over the streets, but we didn't have a permit to take over the streets. So you can just imagine police running up against community, pushing us on the sidewalk, using their motorbikes. I mean, it was a pretty difficult day, right, to engage in that march. What ended up happening is we now know it as May Day Melee. It became a whole thing in MacArthur Park where the police ascended with batons and, with all kinds of force to shut down the march. And in the aftermath, we had a lot of community organizations like the ACLU and some other legal rights groups putting together a lawsuit against the city for what happened and the harm that it caused the communities that were a part of this day. And I'll never forget, it was on the stage, and one of the lawyers, I mean, it was a packed house, a packed auditorium of members of the migrant community there in LA. And one of the things that she said, she's like, I just want to be clear that you're not going to win the lotto if you're here. And I remember this moment where one of the mothers that I organized with stood up, she's like, I don't care if we get a cent, but I want the police chief to go, right? And I remember this moment where she was very clear that the terms of relationality, even though we understand that compensation, as we think about moving forward with service learning, can often come in the ways that we literally monetarily compensate, and that's good. But I also want to be clear that so much of the work we do in community is rested in relationship. Reciprocity isn't always monetary. So let me give an example of that. So many of us in teacher education, I would argue, I know in my department, we have veteran teacher educators who in the last 25 years have not stepped a foot in a public school. They're doing all kinds of service learning courses. They're teaching about community engagement, but they haven't been in a public school in 25 years. So what are you actually teaching teachers to do if you have no idea what's going on in those classrooms? I would argue as a mother organizers, if the mothers see you showing up and being a part of those spaces and willing to build with them, trust they will show up for you. And so I think about there's other ways that we can build a different kind of mutuality in the work. When the institution isn't ready, but we're in the community, it speaks volumes about the kinds of relationships that can be built. So I go back to that piece of like, are we showing up? Are we committing to those 3 things? Are we engaged in movement building beyond the university? And now I know for some of you who are on a tenure track, I know that's scary. Because so much of the way that we're measured and our value is based on the tenure process. But I still want to say, like, to think about the underlying core of the work, that we're engaged in movement building beyond, it really pays dividends in the long run of the way that those communities will shape the way that they're invited into the institution to do the work, even when money's not on the table yet. So I want to think about it.
So I'd like to end with this last question, which I think really centers much of what this conference has been about, which is, the space of service learning, and community engagement on a global scale. So how can the lessons you have learned be applied to other parts of the world, such as the Caribbean, Mexico, or even further away in China and the Philippines, etc.?
Wow, that's a good question. And again, I'm not sure I'm going to answer this satisfactorily, but I'm going to answer it through the story of my dad. So
Don't make me cry.
you're going to make me cry. So I lost my dad earlier this year. My dad passed away in February. Actually, I buried my dad 2 days before the Hawaii conference. And I don't normally talk about it because then this happens. But I'm going to share the story of my dad because I do think it has some relevance to this question. So my father was born in Colón, Panama in 1943 to an Afro-Latina mother. Now again, I always think about my privilege. I am a 6 foot, light skin, and I identify as Chicana because for me, LA was all about LA was life for me. It still is. The lowrider, the eyeliner, the big hoops, the lipstick, you know what I mean? Like that is better, right? But I think about that history that I often don't talk about because of the complexity of my father. My father's father was from Ecuador, from Quito. And when my grandfather died, he was only 45. My dad was the eldest in his family. And so he ended up being in charge of his 7 younger siblings and my grandma. But when my grandfather passed away, his family, who actually had resources, basically disowned my father and his family because of anti-Blackness, because of my grandma. So my father in that moment says, you know what? I'm going to leave this place, never going to come back. I'm going to take my family, kind of like F you to my grandfather's family, right? And so he leaves under this condition of anti-Blackness. He leaves Panama, takes his family, and he lands in LA as a migrant. And in that process, my father started working as a mechanic. And when he was working as a mechanic, a lot of the LA County Sheriff cars would come in and get service. So my father started to get curious, and they started to get curious about him and said, have you ever thought about becoming a police officer? So my father hadn't thought about it, but says, okay, I think this could be good. Well, my father was training for the police academy. He gets recruited by the FBI. And my father becomes part of COINTELPRO. Anybody here familiar with COINTELPRO? So my father was Angela Davis's bodyguard for 3 years. So to think about where I started this presentation, and to think about my father, he worked closely with us. He baptized us at Chavez's kids. He spied on Isabel Allende. He traveled all over the world. Now, I didn't know about this till I was a doctoral student. Because my dad goes, Mija, I never thought you would study these things. I thought you were going to get us out of the poorhouse and become an engineer. So when he started seeing who I was starting to read and what I was starting to become, he's like, I got to tell you something. So you can just imagine as a mid-20-year-old going like, what? And I didn't talk to my dad for 2 years because I was so upset. After about 2 years, my dad starts to come around and he's excited. I'm like, I go, Dad, how is it that you could have left anti-Blackness only to embrace it when you started working undercover? I don't understand that logic. And then he looks to me and he says, but Mija, that's how I paid for your school. Because you are the epitome of this quote unquote American dream. You are the reason we left so that you and your sister could have a good life. Now, when I share that story, I think about these contradictions because the international part of this, I think about how those stories across the world, how we think about the ways, and in my case, my father, what propels us to migrate, what propels us to leave home, and then what are the ensnarements when you get here? A few years ago, I did this work where I started to study, this discrepancy between educational outcomes and occupational, where people land occupationally. But we found out there was one occupation in which Black and brown men made more than white men. I'm sure you can guess which one that is. It's law enforcement. So the question for me becomes, what happens when the state and surveillance and these systems prey on our community, and what happens when we begin to internalize these things. So I always tell students, you can have white supremacy in a room with no white people in it. The same way you can have patriarchy in a room with no men in it. And so we have understandings as structural things, then something else opens up for us. That's abolition. And it's as intimate as the story of my father. Fast forward several years ago, my father was diagnosed with the same disease that Bruce Willis has. He was diagnosed with frontal temporal dementia with aphasia. So I had to record him before he lost his ability to speak, because I wanted to get down the details of his story, because we need to talk about that too. What I found out when he passed, several of his former officers wanted to get together and be like, Vero, we want to share with you the stories of your dad. What I came to find out was that 80% of the people that my father worked with undercover had the same disease. Now, the disease for my father was one that when he wakes up in the morning, when he was alive and wake up in the morning, like I would drive him somewhere and my dad would stop me. He's like, Mija, I'm gonna give me the 9-digit violation code for jaywalking. And I'm like, how do you remember this? But he couldn't remember what he had for breakfast that morning. See, I always think about what the state did to my father is that they took away his ability to make new memories with his grandson, with our families, and instead was locked into the time when he was working undercover. That's the only thing that he could remember. I can't think of anything more violent than you being able to lose your ability to make more memories. So I share that because when I think about how deep the logics run, the logics run deep. And someone could argue, well, he's diversifying the police force. He's giving a good name to Latinos. But watching how my dad passed away and watching the last few years of being at home caring for my dad was a reminder to me that when I think about abolition, it's about life and death. It's not just an academic concept, it's just not a theory. So watching my dad go through that. So I wanted to share that because I think, to me, that puts this perspective, I think, on some level of what happened to my father, but it's connected to what happened to him in Panama. It's connected to what happens to so many people in many places around the world. But where do we have the spaces to really think about that? And so that's been my life journey to figure out how do we amplify those spaces. So thank you.
Let's say thank you. Thank you, Chris.